You probably think you know about Napoleon Bonaparte's death, right? The great emperor who conquered Europe, exiled to the small island of St. Helena, died peacefully in 1821 after a brief illness. That's the official version they taught you in school. Well, prepared to have that image completely shattered. Because the truth about Napoleon's final moments is so terrifying and disturbing that it was deliberately censored for over 200 years to protect his historical reputation. Here's the first shocking truth that will blow your perception apart. Napoleon didn't die peacefully. He spent his final days screaming in agony, convulsing violently, and begging for mercy from invisible enemies that only he could see. The eyewitnesses, doctors, servants, and British officials documented scenes so horrible that many refused to speak about what they witnessed for the rest of their lives, fearing they would be considered insane or liars. But wait, it gets much worse. Napoleon's screams weren't just from physical pain. They were shrieks of absolute terror, as if he was seeing something so terrifying that his mind couldn't process it. Witnesses reported that he screamed specific phrases in French like, "Don't take me, they're coming for revenge, and forgive me for the Moscow dead," always referring to invisible forces that apparently pursued him mercilessly during his final moments. And here's the truly disturbing part. These weren't casual deliriums of a dying man. Napoleon was experiencing psychological terror so intense that contemporary doctors documented how he alternated between moments of total lucidity, where he discussed military strategies with perfect clarity, and episodes of absolute panic, where he behaved as if he was being physically attacked by entities no one else could see. The most shocking aspect were the specific details Napoleon screamed during his terror episodes. He mentioned specific soldiers who had died in battles decades before, described faces of people he had ordered executed, and seemed to be responding to accusations of crimes that only he could hear. It was as if all the ghosts of his military decisions had gathered in St. Helena to personally confront him during his final moments. But the most terrifying truth is that Napoleon-esque screams were so intense and disturbing they could be heard from outside the house where he was dying. Local St. Helena residents reported being awakened during the night by horrible shrieks coming from the former emperor's residence. Some described the sounds as more terrifying than the screams of wounded soldiers on battlefields, and as if the devil himself was being tortured. The conspiracy to hide this information began immediately after Napoleon's death. British officials, French doctors, and even political enemies tacitly agreed that revealing the real details of his agony would be harmful to European political stability. The image of the great emperor dying in absolute terror could inspire revolts, question the divine authority of leaders, or simply traumatize populations who idealize Napoleon as a hero. Most disturbing of all is that detailed medical records, personal diaries, and official correspondence exist, documenting every terrifying aspect of Napoleon's death. But these documents were systematically suppressed, altered or lost over the centuries to maintain the sanitized version we know today. You're about to discover not only how Europe's most powerful man spent his final days screaming in terror, but why his agony was so extreme that adult witnesses, war veterans, accustomed to violence, developed permanent trauma just from observing his suffering. Napoleon's death was on the peaceful end of a great leader. It was a terrifying demonstration of how even emperors can be reduced to the most primitive terror when confronted with the final consequences of their actions. If you thought Napoleon's deterioration would be just the normal decline of an elderly man in exile, prepare to discover how the body of the man who once commanded Europe transformed into a putrid mass of decomposing flesh that made even experienced doctors vomit just from approaching him. Talking about physical deterioration. So grotesque and accelerated that it defied all medical knowledge of the era, and created conditions where Napoleon literally rotted while still alive and conscious. The decomposition began subtly but sinisterly approximately 2 years before his death, when servants in St. Helena began noticing a persistent and nauseating odor emanating from Napoleon's quarters. Here's something that will shock you. It wasn't just poor hygiene or common illness. It was the unmistakable smell of dead flesh, mixed with something chemical and sickly sweet that era. Doctors described as perfume of death combined with hellish substances. The odor was so penetrating it could be detected over 50 meters away from anywhere Napoleon had been. But wait, The physical deterioration escalated in ways mathematically impossible to explain through normal medical processes. Napoleon began developing dark spots that were UND wounds or bruises. They were areas where flesh literally died and began rotting while still attached to his living body. These spots spread like infection, but didn't respond to any known treatment, and seemed to follow specific patterns that corresponded exactly to locations where he had been wounded in battles decades before. And here's the truly terrifying part. Napoleon began literally losing pieces of himself. Fragments of dead skin would detach and fall to the floor as he walked, leaving trails of decomposing flesh wherever he passed. His fingers developed open wounds that never healed. But instead of bleeding, normally they secreted a dark, viscous fluid that had such a repugnant odor that servants refused to clean without using perfume-soaked cloths to cover their noses and mouths. The deterioration accelerated when Napoleon developed what contemporary doctors called progressive death of limbs. His legs began darkening and swelling grotesquely. Not due to normal swelling, but because tissue was literally dying from the inside out. The flesh of his calves became soft and began separating from bone, creating situations where larger pieces of Napoleon would simply detach and had to be removed to prevent them from falling publicly during his appearances. But the most disturbing aspect was how Napoleon remained mentally lucid throughout this entire process of living decomposition. He was perfectly aware that his body was rotting around his mind, and frequently made sardonic comments about his condition. Once he told a doctor, "It seems my body decided to die before me. Perhaps it's more intelligent than I am." This combination of mental clarity with extreme physical deterioration created a psychologically torturous situation where he watched his own body disintegrate piece by piece. Doctors who examined Napoleon during this period documented conditions that corresponded to no known disease. His flesh developed abnormal textures. Some areas became hard as leather, others became soft as gelatin, and some seemed to be crystallizing in ways that created formations that cut from within, causing constant internal bleeding. It was as if different parts of his body were dying through completely different and incompatible processes. The situation became so grotesque that Napoleon had to completely modify his daily routine to hide the extent of his decomposition. He wore special gloves to hide his putrefying hands, elaborate clothing to camouflage areas where his skin had detached, and perfumes in such excessive quantities that they created an aromatic cloud around him. But even so, the smell of death was inescapable. Most terrifying of all was how the deterioration seemed intentional and targeted. The areas of Napoleon's body that rotted first corresponded exactly to locations where he had made specific military decisions. His right hand, which signed battle orders, developed severe his feet, which carried him across battlefields, began rotting. And his mouth, which gave deadly commands, developed internal wounds that made him bleed whenever he spoke for prolonged periods. If you thought Napoleon's physical deterioration was the most disturbing aspect of his final days, prepare to discover how his mind became a battlefield populated by the ghosts of everyone he had killed, tortured, or betrayed during his rise to power. We're talking about hallucinations so vivid and terrifying that they transformed the man who once commanded millions of soldiers into a cowering, paranoid wreck who spent his nights hiding under furniture and begging invisible enemies for forgiveness. The psychological horror began approximately 6 months before Napoleon's death, when he started reporting visits from old friends who shouldn't have been able to reach Saint Helena. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. These weren't random delusions or fever dreams. Napoleon described specific individuals with perfect accuracy. Soldiers he had personally sent to die in hopeless battles. Political prisoners he had ordered executed. Even childhood friends he had betrayed during his climb to power. He knew their names, their faces, their exact words, and most terrifyingly, he seemed to be having actual conversations with them. The hallucinations evolved into systematic psychological torture that followed predictable patterns. Every night around 2 a.m., Napoleon would begin screaming about the Committee of the Dead, an apparition he claimed consisted of representatives from every major battle where his decisions had caused mass casualty. He described them in horrifying detail. Soldiers from Austerlitz with their faces blown off, Russian peasants frozen to death during the retreat from Moscow, and Spanish civilians executed during his peninsular campaigns. Each ghost allegedly presented him with detailed accusations of his war crimes and demanded individual explanations for their deaths. And here's the most chilling aspect. Napoleon's hallucinations contained information he shouldn't have known. During his terror episodes, he would scream out specific details about battles he hadn't personally witnessed, mention soldiers by name whom he had never met, and describe execution methods used by his subordinates in distant territories. It was as if his guilt had given him supernatural access to every atrocity committed in his name across Europe. And now all those victims were demanding accountability simultaneously. The psychological breakdown became so severe that Napoleon developed multiple distinct personalities to cope with different categories of accusers. British officials documented how he would speak in different voices during his episodes. Sometimes as the Emperor defending his strategic decisions, other times as little Corporal Bonaparte, claiming he was just following orders, and most disturbingly occasionally as his victims themselves apparently channeling their final words and death agonies. Witnesses reported entire conversations where Napoleon argued with himself using the voices of people he had killed decades earlier. His hallucinations also became increasingly specific about the afterlife punishments awaiting him. Napoleon described in terrifying detail a place he called the Tribunal of Shadows, where he would be forced to personally experience every death he had caused. He claimed the ghosts showed him visions of his post-mortem fate, eternally reliving the final moments of consciousness of every soldier who died following his orders, feeling their pain, their fear, and their desperation as they bled out on foreign battlefields far from home. The most disturbing evidence was how Napoleon's hallucinations accurately predicted events that hadn't happened yet. He screamed warnings about specific family members who would die in particular ways, military disasters that would befall France decades in the future, and political upheavals that wouldn't occur until long after his death. Some of these predictions proved remarkably accurate, leading witnesses to question whether Napoleon was experiencing genuine supernatural visitations, or if his guilt had driven him so completely insane that he was prophesying his own worst fears. British guards reported that Napoleon's hallucinations became so intense he would physically fight invisible attackers, throwing punches at empty air, ducking from imaginary weapons, and begging for mercy from accusers only he could see. He developed massive bruises from throwing himself against walls while trying to escape his ghostly and repeatedly injured himself during violent struggles against enemies that existed only in his deteriorating mind. The final stage of his psychological horror involved Napoleon claiming he could see the Great Reckoning, a supernatural courtroom where every decision he had ever made was being judged by the accumulated spirits of his victims. He described judges made of smoke and shadow, prosecutors who spoke with the voices of widowed mothers, and evidence presented in the form of mass graves that stretched beyond the horizon. The man who had once believed himself chosen by destiny was now convinced he was damned by divine justice, and his hallucinations had become a preview of eternal punishment that made his physical agony seem merciful by comparison. If you thought Napoleon's psychological torment was the most horrifying aspect of his final days, prepare to discover how his body was literally dissolving from the inside out in ways that defied every medical understanding of the era. We are talking about a physical deterioration so grotesque and medically impossible that doctors who witnessed it refused to document the most disturbing details, fearing they would be accused of fabricating supernatural horror stories rather than recording medical observations. The visceral nightmare began with what Napoleon's personal physician initially dismissed as routine stomach problems. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. Within weeks, Napoleon was unjust vomiting. He was expelling chunks of what appeared to be his own internal organs, mixed with blood so dark it looked like tar. Modern forensic analysis of preserved samples suggests the blood had been sitting in his stomach for days, decomposing and fermenting before being violently expelled in episodes that lasted for hours. But wait, the physical horror escalated beyond anything medical science could explain at the time. Napoleon began vomiting substances that shouldn't have been able to form in a living human body. Witnesses described black gelatinous masses that moved independently after being expelled, chunks of tissue that still appeared to be pulsing with their own blood supply, and liquids that emitted vapors so toxic that anyone who got too close would immediately begin retching and experiencing severe headaches. And here is the most medically impossible aspect. The volume of material Napoleon expelled far exceeded what his body should have been able to produce. Over the course of a single night, he would vomit what doctors estimated to be more blood than a human body. Actually contains mixed with tissue masses that appeared to be pieces of organs that were somehow still functioning inside his body. It was as if his internal anatomy was being systematically dissolved and expelled while remaining functional enough to keep him alive and conscious throughout the process. The composition of Napoleon's vomit became increasingly bizarre and terrifying as his condition progressed. Doctors documented finding what appeared to be partially digested bone fragments, hair-like structures that didn't match any known human tissue, and crystalline formations that shouldn't have been able to develop inside a living organism. Some samples continued to emit heat for hours after being while others seemed to absorb light in ways that made them appear almost luminescent in dark rooms. British medical officers who examined Napoleon's expelled matter reported finding tissue samples that appeared to be from organs he shouldn't have been able to survive without. They documented what looked like pieces of heart muscle, fragments of brain tissue, and chunks of liver that still showed signs of recent blood circulation. The medical impossibility was staggering. Napoleon was apparently vomiting up his own vital organs, while those same organs continued functioning inside his body. The smell accompanying Napoleon's vomiting episodes was so overwhelming and chemically complex that it affected everyone in his residence. Witnesses described an odor that combined rotting flesh with metallic substances and something they could only describe as the smell of burning souls. The stench was so penetrating that it soaked into furniture, clothing, and even the stone walls of his residence, creating a permanent aura of decay that lingered for months after his death. Perhaps most disturbing were the sounds accompanying Napoleon's vomiting fits. Witnesses reported hearing not just the expected retching and gagging, but also sounds that seemed to come from inside his body. Grinding noises like bones being crushed. Bubbling sounds as if liquids were boiling in his stomach, and most terrifyingly, what some described as voices or screaming coming from the expelled matter itself. Doctors who listened with primitive stethoscopes claimed they could hear multiple heartbeats inside Napoleon's chest, as if his body was hosting several different circulatory systems simultaneously. The final weeks brought vomiting episodes so violent that Napoleon would lose consciousness from the physical trauma, only to wake up surrounded by pools of black blood mixed with unidentifiable organic matter. His servants had to change his bedding multiple times per day, and the expelled material was so corrosive that it actually ate through fabric and stained metal surfaces permanently. The man who had once been the most powerful person in Europe was being consumed from within by his own body, transformed into a living biological disaster that challenged every assumption about human anatomy and the limits of physical suffering. Medical examination of the residue left behind revealed chemical compounds that should have been able to form inside a human body, suggesting that Napoleon's internal chemistry had somehow become fundamentally altered in ways that turned his own organs into toxic substances that his body was desperately trying to expel before they killed him. If you thought Napoleon's physical and psychological torment couldn't get any worse, prepare to witness the most terrifying death sequence ever documented in human history. We were talking about 18 hours of absolute horror where the former emperor of Europe transformed into something that witnesses described as no longer human, a screaming, convulsing creature whose final words were so disturbing that several people who heard them immediately fled St. Helena and refused to ever speak of what they witnessed. The final countdown began at 6 a.m. on May 5th, 1821, when Napoleon suddenly sat upright in bed and began screaming a single phrase repeatedly. "I les viens en me! Churcher! They're coming for me!" But hear us, what makes this truly chilling? He wasn't looking at anything visible in the room. His eyes were fixed on empty space above his bed, tracking movement that no one else could see, and his expression showed pure terror, unlike anything witnesses had ever observed on a human face. But wait, the psychological breakdown escalated into something that transcended normal death agonies. Napoleon began having conversations with invisible entities, pleading desperately in multiple languages. French, Italian, German, and even Russian phrases he had never been heard to speak before. He seemed to be negotiating for his life with accusers only he could perceive, offering to undo battles, resurrect dead soldiers, and surrender territories he no longer controlled. His voice alternated between the commanding tone of an emperor and the whimpering pleas of a terrified child. And here's the most disturbing aspect. Napoleon appeared to be experiencing multiple deaths simultaneously. Witnesses documented periods where he would scream as if being shot, then immediately begin drowning motions as if underwater, followed by convulsions consistent with poisoning, and then burning sensations as if being consumed by fire. It was as if he was being forced to experience every type of death his military campaigns had inflicted on others, cycling through different forms of agony in rapid succession. The physical manifestations became increasingly impossible to explain through normal medical understanding. Napoleon's body temperature fluctuated wildly. Burning hot one moment, ice cold the next, while his pulse alternated between racing frantically and stopping completely 4 minutes at a time. During these cardiac arrests, he remained conscious and continued screaming, creating situations where he appeared to be dead while still experiencing terror. Doctors couldn't explain how someone could maintain consciousness without a detectable heartbeat. His final words weren't the historically recorded France. T-Tay-D-Arm. That was propaganda, created later. According to multiple independent witnesses, Napoleon's actual final coherent statement was far more disturbing. They've come for the reckoning. I see them all. Moscow, Leipzig, Waterloo, all of them. They're dragging me to answer for every drop of blood. He then began screaming names. Thousands of names. Apparently, trying to personally apologize to every soldier who had died under his command. The most terrifying part of his final hours was how Napoleon seemed to be experiencing time non-linearly. He would speak as if he was simultaneously reliving different moments from his past, while experiencing his present death and seeing glimpses of some horrific future fate. He described battles that hadn't happened yet, mentioned people by name who were still alive, and provided details about his own funeral arrangements. That proved remarkably accurate, despite no one having discussed them with him.